Hi everyone, my name is Olaf and I'm recording this from my home in Reykjavik in Iceland. First of all, let me thank the organizers, Julia and Jessica and Martin and Emily, for not giving up on this event and bringing it online despite all the challenges they faced, and for initiating this discourse on research in museums, which is quite a rare one and therefore very appreciated. So before I start, I'd like to give just a quick introduction to myself and what I hope to contribute to this discourse today. I'm currently working towards the end of my PhD in museum studies at the University of Iceland, where I explore museums as research institutions and particularly as platforms for alternative research practices. I'm influenced by recent developments in the higher arts education sector, where I've worked during the last decade, where practice-based research has entered the scene, creating lively debates on what counts as research and what not, and many other related issues. So this form of research has opened critical and inspiring questions on the nature of research and its social relevance. And I think these questions could be equally relevant to the museum sector when it comes to reflecting on knowledge production through museum practice. So I guess my contribution to the discourse today will be rather on an abstract note, where I'll be reflecting on the nature of doing research in museums and how we can articulate the value and significance embedded in that particular form of research. So then on to the first slide. So if we first quickly just establish museums as research-driven institutions, we have, of course, the very beginning of the history of museums in the Renaissance, where the act of collecting, storing, and displaying was driven by items like investigation, exploration, and curiosity. These are the basic elements in all research activity till this day. And in addition, sensuous elements like texture and smell and vision, and sound and form and shape were fundamental not only in the shaping of the knowledge of that time, but also on what form that knowledge took. We also know that museums developed parallel to other epistemological formations, such as the scientific disciplines, universities, libraries, archives, etc. And finally, museums have been described as forms of meta-narratives through which society is constituted. And also they've been described as methods, as mediums, or even as epistemological machines. We also know that there's an extremely vast variety of research practices within most museums, and that diverse terms are used to describe them. Apart from a subject-specific or disciplinary research, with their strong affinities with all the major academic disciplines, many other types of research thrive in museums. For example, visitor research, pedagogical research, and marketing research, and so on. But for this talk, and I think for this conference in general, we are mainly interested in collections-based, curatorial-based, or practice-based research in the museum, and in understanding how that research modality can best thrive and grow. And here I use the term museum-based research to refer to practice-based research taking place in the museum through professional museum practice on subjects typically related to the museum collection or the museum mission. At the same time, we know that museums are among the most significant knowledge institutions in today's society. We see that research as practice in museums remains quite ambiguous and fairly unarticulated. Other core activities like collecting, preserving, education and display usually remain fairly defined, both to museum staff and visitors. It has also been established that research can mean very many different things to different museums of different types and to different museum staff members, and that various research cultures thrive in various national and international settings. Moreover, museology as the academic discipline that studies museums rarely addresses the topic of research in its literature. Some scholars have pointed out how since the advent of new museology that came about at the turn of the 90s, less and less emphasis has been placed on objects and collections, while more and more emphasis has been placed on public programming and public events. Other issues, another issue with research being an obscure practice in museums is that they are becoming more and more compartmentalized. The museums are becoming more and more compartmentalized, where educational staff does the work of public programming and events, while curators perform their work on the collection behind the scenes. And not only does this create an internal division among staff, but also it creates a disconnection between research on the one hand and its dissemination on the other. Yet, the output of museum-based research holds some very distinct epistemological qualities and characteristics that conventional academic research does not. As opposed to discursive forms of dissemination in the academic domain, museum-based research, through its exhibitionary technologies of display, generates knowledge that is embodied, spatial, and material, and in addition to whatever discursive modes museums have at hand at any given time. And furthermore, museum-based research is situated at the intersection between science on the one hand and culture on the other. By creating output that is discursive and immersive at the same time, exhibitions plus catalogs or texts or websites or events or conferences or whatever. And as such, it holds what has been called the double agency of practice-based research, oscillating between the two domains of science and culture and having impact in both simultaneously. It is precisely this unique ability museums have to cross borders that underpins their agency as research institutions in my mind. Not only do they cross borders between the two domains of science and culture, but they also hold the opportunity to be equally inclusive in both domains, where division lines between research and public programming or society are able to be dissolved through the very work or operation of the museum. And I think this is particularly relevant in curatorial research. Curatorial research is a new field only emerging in the last few years within museological literature. The notion of curating as research, I think, offers useful indications on how to escape binary oppositions between theory and practice, the discursive and the immersive, thinking and doing. Also, it instigates critical questions on the significance of knowledge production in the context of public museums and its relationship with display and museum audience. Situated in the borderline between science and culture, curatorial research holds two kinds of knowledges. On the one hand, theoretical and propositional knowledge, and on the other, practical knowledge, embodied or implicit knowledge, or what is called tacit knowledge. Although I'm borrowing this model from the discourse on artistic research or practice-based research in the arts, I think this way of articulating the epistemological significance of museum-based research can be useful for the museum sector in order to better circumscribe and define the value of doing research in museums in general. On that note, I'd like to end by discussing the notion of the curatorial as a framework for describing curating as research. And here I'm drawing on Rogoff and Martinon's book on the curatorial, a philosophy of curating from 2013, where they develop an idea of curating as a reflexive and critical activity that aims at expanding traditional knowledge systems. Curating is seen as an activity that seeks to rethink structures rather than simply adding information to existing ones. Here, the curatorial is seen as a disruptive, destabilizing practice that pushes curating out of its comfort zone in order to give birth to new knowledges and new understandings. So rather than using the form of the exhibition to stage finalized research results, the curatorial aim is here to engage in a dynamic process of asking questions, of interaction, experimentation, and dissemination in a non-propositional form. And it is here where I think curators could learn from the artistic research model, particularly the notion of critical reflection. In artistic research, critical reflection takes place perpetually throughout the research process and also after its completion. Critical reflection it is used as a tool to articulate and reflect on the very act of doing research through practice and to describe the interrelationship between theory and practice. And again, how that interplay influences the content and the very form of knowledge coming out of that process. So as such, it could be called doing research at the meta level. But why frame curating as research? I think by critically reflecting on curating as research, we are able to explore the role of non-discursive elements in the knowledge-making process, such as objects, space, and the body. To actually investigate the exhibition as a form of research where an embodiment of theory takes place, hosted by the museum as a particular site for that research to take place, critical reflection would create an added dimension or added value to the research process in my mind. I also believe that the curatorial mode of research has the potential to escape disciplinary knowledge practices and as such add an alternative dimension to the already existing knowledge structures. Sorry. And by deploying exhibitionary techniques of display, where knowledge is mediated through material, object-based, three-dimensional displays, exhibitions have the potential to create what has been called research surplus or enhanced epistemological significance of museums. The museum has the potential to move beyond the dissemination of already established knowledge to create a shift in understanding and producing new ideas. And this is made possible through the non-textual quality of objects that makes them accessible to interrogation and through the very particular way museums and exhibitions ask us to look at objects and to think through them and to think with them. So what I said before about museums having obscure or ambiguous approaches to research practice, I think that as extra discursive, immersive, experiential, and open-ended platforms, I think that museums have a lot to contribute to alternative research platforms, especially in terms of enriching and expanding the conventional or traditional scientific mode of conducting research, but only by articulating the very distinct epistemological qualities museum-based or curatorial-based research holds, we are able to qualify that very contribution. And here's where I think the discourse in artistic research can be very useful, as I've tried to show. So that's it for now. Thank you very much, and goodbye.